Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And I want to start by thanking everybody who showed an interest in, who engaged with my video from last week, which was on Anne Boleyn and the time that she spent at the Tower of London in both 1533 and 1536. The engagement, the responses, the comments were just fabulous, so insightful, and I am really very grateful. Now, if that video sounds brilliant to you, but you weren't informed about it and you think that you should have been, maybe, and I will remind you at the end as well, have a little check that you are still subscribed, that you've hit the bell, and that you selected all in the drop down. I know that people have clicked all these buttons and they're still not being notified, but just make sure it's still the case for you, and hopefully it will start working eventually. Either way, I will be leaving that video linked in case you weren't notified, you can't find it, but you'd like to watch it. Off the back of that video, in particular off the back of the discussion in both the live chat and the comments, I do think that I now have some directions of travel for at least 2 more videos to this channel. One that I'm going to be doing in the future is going to look at scaffold speeches. In particular, why the people delivering those speeches frequently seem to praise the monarch, in whose name and by whose command they were being put to death on that very scaffold. Indeed, when people refer to a desire to, quote, make a good death in the past, what exactly do they mean? What are they referring to? But for today, the other video that the comments and chat inspired me to make is an exploration of treason. In particular, I want to look at the legal understanding, or rather that should perhaps be understandings, of that term. But before we take a look at today's topic, I want to say an absolutely massive thank you to History Hit for sponsoring another video on this channel. I have just finished watching the incredible The Rise of Cleopatra over on History Hit.
She is the most famous woman from ancient history, a living goddess who captured the hearts of 2 of Rome's greatest generals and oversaw a golden age for her kingdom.
It's a great story of a great individual, undoubtedly. It's also absolutely pivotal in the history of Egypt and in the history of the ancient world.
From Caesar to Shakespeare to modern cinema, her story has remained as popular as ever. Her name despised, idolized, and mythologized. Cleopatra.
I loved this documentary, and I know that you will too. History Hit brings you the stories that shape the world through their award-winning online history channel and podcast network. It's like Netflix, but it's all history. With History Hit, you can stream and download hundreds of hours of original history documentaries anywhere, anytime, on any device. You can watch on your mobile, tablet, desktop, Xbox, or your TV. Brought to you by expert historians such as Dan Snow, Professor Susanna Lipscomb, Dan Jones, and more. And as well as already having hundreds of expert-led programmes, they add 2 more every week. Click the link in my description box to find out more and to subscribe to History Hit. As an added bonus, History Hit are offering my viewers a very special discount. If you use the code READINGTHEPAST30 at checkout, you will get 30% off of an annual subscription. Thanks again to History Hit for sponsoring this video. But now, let's talk treason. In researching for this video, I am indebted to and very grateful for the recent exhibition on treason that was held at the National Archives. I did buy the book connected to the exhibition, and it is also fabulous. So if you didn't get a chance to see this exhibition, which is now sadly closed, there is still the option of checking out the book. And if you do so, please do let us all know your thoughts on it in the comments section. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, The word treason has its origins or etymology through the now obsolete terms tray and trays, which meant to betray. Indeed, the earliest extant recorded use of the word treason, referring to the, quote, action of betraying, betrayal of the trust undertaken by or reposed in anyone, breach of faith, treacherous action, treachery, was published in around 1225. But it is thought that the text in question may have been composed earlier, in around 1200. The OED entry for treason also has a subsection that deals with the law. It reads as follows, quote, in Old English law, treason was either high treason, an offence against the King's Majesty or the safety of the Commonwealth, or petty, spelt in the French way, or petty, spelt in the English way, treason. An offence committed against a subject. Petty treason is now punished only as murder, and high treason is usually styled simply as treason. Many acts of high treason are now treated as treason felony. The earliest recorded extant use of this term with this context is given as 1292. 60 years later, treason would be formally defined in a legal context, in the 25th year of the reign of King Edward III, through the Treason Act of 1351. We have just spent some time looking at the OED entries, in which we see the earliest extant use of the term treason in a legal context, and that predates 1351. Because treason as a concept had existed long before this act came into force. Indeed, it had been deployed as a charge to be answered and had resulted in numerous executions. Nevertheless, what it was not was defined. And by that I mean we had a concept that treason was a thing that you could be punished for, but just what constituted treason, what acts or offences might be termed as treason, was not yet stated, was not yet set down. This statute, the Treason Act of 1351, did just that, and arguably it continues to do so, because this statute remains in force in my country to this very day, albeit with emendations. The original act was written in medieval French, which I don't read or indeed understand. Fortunately, though, there is an open access translation of the Act, which I will be leaving linked. The, quote, statute made at Westminster in the Parliament holden in the Feast of Saint Hilary. This is referring to Hilary term, which runs from January to April, in the 25th year of the reign of King Edward III. This text comes with marginal annotations that tell the reader that this document contains a, quote, declaration of what offences shall be adjudged treason, compassing, meaning planning, the death of the king, queen, or their eldest son, violating the queen, or the king's eldest daughter unmarried, or his eldest son's wife, levying war, adhering to the king's enemies, counterfeiting the king's seals or money, importing counterfeit money, killing the chancellor, treasurer, or judges in execution of their duty. The statute also declares that for those convicted of treason, quote, the king shall have the forfeiture of all the offender's lands. This meant that, unless the king was minded to be merciful, that a convicted traitor could, indeed would, leave nothing for their heirs to inherit. The dynasty would be impoverished. Indeed, dynasties could be wholly ruined if the person that sat at the top of that dynasty were to be convicted of acting against the king in one of these ways. The statute continues, quote, and moreover there is another manner of treason, that is to say, when a servant slayeth his master, or a wife her husband, or when a man secular or religious slayeth his prelate, to whom he oweth faith and obedience. This list of offences constituted petty treason, as opposed to the previous list, which would come to be known as high treason. In both instances, the offence is compounded due to the perpetrator ignoring the established and expected obedience or fealty to their victim. For a king to kill their subject, it is murder. But for a subject to kill their king, it is treason. And so it is similar in the case of petty treason. The husband who kills his wife is a murderer. But the wife, whose submission and obedience to her husband were the expectation, indeed, at the time it was believed they were a divinely ordered requirement, she would be guilty of petty treason if she killed her husband. The statute is also explicit in leaving the proverbial door open for, quote, new questions of treason, which it states, quote, shall be decided in Parliament. Those questions would in fact arise, and they would be decided in Parliament. Numerous changes to the statute-based understanding of treason have occurred between then and now. There have been repeals in regard to, for example, petty treason, which no longer exists in the statute of today. Also repealed were the counterfeit coin creation and importation parts of the treason statute. That no longer stands today either. Now, I'm fairly certain that none of us would want to spend probably the better part of a day sat here together with me detailing every incremental shift in the statutes concerning treason that have appeared and occurred over the nearly 7 intervening centuries. And so instead, I'm going to pull out a selection of the more interesting shifts, at least as far as I'm concerned. In 1496, which was during the reign of King Henry VII, at the end of an act to make some offences petty treason, comes the following paragraph, quote, also be it ordained by the said authority, that if any lay person hereafter propensedly, meaning deliberately, indeed in modern legal parlance, I think the term would be premeditatedly, murder their lord, master, or sovereign immediate. That last one is referring to a person that sits above them in the social hierarchy rather than the sovereign, who at this time, of course, would have been the king. That they hereafter be not admitted to their clergy, and after conviction or attainder of any such person so hereafter offending, had after the course of the law, that the same person be put in execution as though he were no clerk. This legal shift was seeking to limit the bounds of benefit of clergy. It was looking to make petty treason a crime for which benefit of clergy could not be called upon. Now, it was already not possible to use this benefit in cases of high treason. The legal loophole of benefit of clergy had originally offered clergymen the privilege of claiming exemption from the trial or censure of secular courts if they were accused of committing a felony. And in some cases, a conviction for a felony would result in a sentence of death. Benefit of clergy allowed an individual to avoid that happening to them. At the start, it seems that the test for an individual's clerical credentials, their right to claim benefit of clergy, was that they said they were a cleric or a clergyman and that they appeared looking like they were one too. But from at least 1475, there is reference being made to the, quote, neck verse. So assessing a person's right to claim benefit of clergy had now come down to essentially a literacy test. Was the person claiming to be a cleric able to read the neck verse? This verse got its name because it could, quite literally, save your neck from being hanged. The accused would be presented with part of the Bible in Latin. The part in question was usually the beginning of Psalm 51, and as this was the tradition, presumably a fair few people knew this, perhaps indeed anyone and everyone. So if you thought you were going to be charged with a felony, would you not just take the time to by rote learn the Latin of the beginning of Psalm 51 and thus use it to save your neck? You haven't really got to learn to read, you just have to learn to repeat, maybe. Psalm 51 translates into English as, "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness. According unto the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgressions." Through this neck verse, whether read or simply recited, it had become possible for lay people, those who were outside of clerical orders, to claim this benefit now, due only to their literacy, or perhaps in some cases, their professed or feigned literacy. If we would like to see a famous example of a literate layperson who made this claim, we can do so if we travel back in time to the 22nd of September 1598. On this date, Ben Jonson, the famous playwright and poet but not priest, was indicted at Shoreditch. The charge against him was manslaughter. Ben Jonson had duelled with and ultimately killed the actor Gabriel Spencer, so Jonson was now in very real danger of being taken for a trip to the gallows. But he read the neck verse, and he escaped execution. However, Jonson's goods were seized. He was branded on the thumb to show that he was now a convicted felon. If an individual who bore a mark like this, the brand on the thumb, were to find themselves once again in the sort of trouble that might get a person executed, then they weren't going to be able to use the neck verse to get away again. If they committed a second sufficiently high-level offence, that time they would be going to the gallows. When making the legal change in 1496, to remove access to benefit of clergy from those who had been accused and convicted of petty treason, I think it's interesting that Henry VII's Act writers include a story. It's the story of a yeoman by the name of James Graham, who had murdered his master, one Richard Tracy, a gentleman. I say it's interesting because in this Act reference, it doesn't talk about the accused trying to claim benefit of clergy. Instead, it almost feels like this case has just reminded those in power that there had been similar cases where benefit of clergy had been claimed in the past. And so that leads me to question, are they perhaps simply responding to the reminder rather than the case they're quoting? Throughout history, our statutes have, with varying degrees of agility, been shifted and moulded in response to, among other things, monarchical preference, particular events, usually fairly seismic ones, advances in technology, and also changes to society, in particular shifts in ethics and morals. In the next reign, after the reign of Henry VII, that of King Henry VIII, the statute changes to the treason laws really pick up a pace. And that's especially the case after 1530. Now, I am sure that it's just a little coincidence that that correlates with the denouement of the King's Great Matter. In 1530, through the so-named Poisoning Act, the definition of high treason was expanded to include the act of killing someone through poison. This act also specified that rather than the traditional punishment for treason of being drawn, hanged and quartered, a poisoner should be boiled to death. There are, however, only 2 cases on record in which this punishment actually occurred. This statute was repealed in 1547. In 1534, an act would make it treason to deny that Henry was the head of the church in England. Similarly, at the same time, it was made treasonous to deny that Anne Boleyn was Henry's true wife and queen, that their daughter Elizabeth was his only rightful heir. It was also treason to plot, attempt, or do them any harm. Despite this, and before too long, Elizabeth would join her half-sister Mary in a shared state of illegitimacy due to the Succession to the Crown Act of 1536. This act removed Elizabeth as her father's heir and so overwrote that particular part of the 1534 Treason Act. In 1541, So, against the backdrop of the fall of Queen Catherine Howard and her lady-in-waiting Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, there was a new Treason Act. This one allowed for the trial and punishment of, quote, lunatics in cases of high treason. This change was undoubtedly a response to Jane Boleyn's mental collapse, which occurred at the time of her arrest. Henry was bound and determined to see her punished, regardless of what the law used to say. At least that's how it seems to me. At this same time, there was another act produced. This one attainted Catherine and her accomplices. Doing this enabled Henry to have them convicted without giving them a trial in court. This Act of Attainder also states that, quote, it shall be lawful for any of the king's subjects, if themselves to perfectly know, or by vehement presumption do perceive, any will, act, or condition of likeness of the body in her, which shall be the queen of this realm, to disclose the same to the king or some of his council. But they shall not openly blow it abroad or whisper it until it be divulged by the king or his council. If the king or any of his successors shall marry a woman which was before incontinent, if she conceal the same, it shall be high treason, and so shall it be in any other knowing it and not revealing it to the king or one of his council before the said marriage or within 20 days after. Another term for the crime of concealing a planned or ongoing treason that is being perpetrated by another person is misprision of treason. But I would argue that perhaps the most referenced act that concerns treason is one that came up in the next reign, in the reign of King Edward VI. In fact, just pop a little hand up emoji in the chat or comments if you have ever heard of the Riot Act. Now, usually we might have been told that someone has been, quote, read the Riot Act. If it's familiar, let me see a hand up. Often the credit for this phrase being in our collective lexicon is given to the 1714 Riot Act. However, 1714 is just a year when this act was reintroduced. If we rewind to 1549, which was a year that saw two significant uprisings, namely the Prayer Book Rebellion and Kett's Rebellion. Do let me know if you'd like me to do a video on one or both of those. 1549 was also the year of the English Riot Act. This act, among other things, sought to add to the definition of treason. According to the Act, it was treason when 12 or more persons gathered together to murder or imprison a member of the Privy Council, when they sought to alter the laws of the realm, and when they refused to disperse when they had been commanded to do so by a justice of the peace, mayor, or sheriff. Hopping forward in time to the reign of Elizabeth I, specifically to the 1584 session of her Parliament, which passed an Act for provision to be made for the surety of the Queen's Majesty's most royal person, and the continuance of the realm in peace. By this Act, any person who treasonously plotted against or acted to harm Elizabeth or remove her from her throne would be barred from claiming the throne themselves, regardless of their own personal blood claim to it. If that convicted individual had heirs who had knowledge or indeed involvement in that self-same plot, they would also be barred from inheriting the throne. The Act also required Elizabeth's subjects to swear to, quote, pursue to death anyone who was guilty of the same offence. This Act was evidently aimed at Mary Queen of Scots, who would be convicted of plotting against Elizabeth and pursued to death and eventually executed in 1587. When Mary Queen of Scots' son, James I of England and VI of Scots, had his life threatened by the Gunpowder Plot in 1605, immediately the statutes were once again reworked. treason was redefined, this time in the Popish Recusants Act of 1605. This act, among other things, stated that it was now high treason to recognise the Pope in Rome as an authority instead of and above the King in England. English Catholics were now required to swear an oath of allegiance to the King in recognition of this change. A large-scale reworking of the Treasons Act would become a requirement in 1649 in the aftermath of the execution of King Charles I, because the nation was, after all, at that point, a commonwealth with no monarch. And as treason statutes of the past had, I believe, almost exclusively positioned the monarch, and in some cases the monarch's immediate family, as the potential victims of an act of high treason, the question becomes, what is treason without a monarchy? Well, according to this act, treason was instead an offence against the Commonwealth and or its government. This sense of treason, this expanded definition is, I'd say, still a massive part of our understanding of the offence of treason today, and that is despite the restoration of the monarchy, which occurred in 1660. I do find it interesting that even after the return of the king, treason maintained, in part, an explicitly national implication. The idea of treason being a crime against the monarch and their family does, of course, still run alongside this, though. The last person to be tried and executed for treason in the UK was William Joyce. He is also known by the nickname Lord Haw Haw. Beginning in 1939, and while Joyce held a British passport, he worked as a radio broadcaster for the propaganda ministry in Germany throughout World War II. Joyce was captured after Germany's surrender in May of 1945. He was then tried and subsequently convicted of treason on the 19th of September 1945. Joyce was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on the 3rd of January 1946. It is often asserted that the death penalty was suspended in the UK in 1965 before being formally and finally abolished in 1969. And that is certainly true for those convicted of murder. However, the death penalty was still on the statute books for some crimes. Indeed, it wasn't until 1998 that the death penalty was abolished for treason and piracy. This happened through the Crime and Disorder Act. According to that act, the penalty for those offences, treason and piracy, is now potentially life imprisonment. The website of the House of Lords Library does have a page on treason law reform, which includes the following quote. On the 20th of May 2019, the then Home Secretary Sajid Javid announced in a speech that the government would consider reforming the law of treason. We have to ensure that we have the necessary powers to meet current and evolving threats to the UK, both domestically and overseas. Officials will examine treason laws to see whether the legislation could be updated to include British nationals who operate on behalf of a hostile nation. The government has yet to publish new proposals concerning treason law. In July 2020, Home Office Minister James Brokenshire said this work was ongoing. Perhaps there will be an update on this for me to share with you all in due course. So what do you think of this exploration of treason? Of the apparently shifting boundaries of that term? Of the way that events, or maybe more properly, anxieties, appear to be motivators for legal changes in English and indeed British history? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comment section underneath this video. I'd also love it if you would pop an emoji or a social glyph, as we're calling them now, in the comments, because frankly, the more engagement a video gets, the more that YouTube will share it, and then we can grow this community and have more people to chat with in the live stream and also in the comment section. For today, let's do something treason-y. Maybe as few weapons as possible, but something that conjures in your mind the notion of treason without doing a bunch of axes, because I think maybe YouTube might hide that. You can find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all the other places that I am locatable on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope that you enjoyed this video and that you found it useful. If you did, please consider sharing with your friends. In fact, if you like the channel, let some pals know about it, and that way you'll have more people to talk about history with in real life as well as on the internet. Please also let me know that you like this particular video by hitting the thumbs up. Do subscribe to the channel, and if you think you're subscribed, now is a great time to check that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will. And while you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, let's be honest, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear. And that way, YouTube will, they claim, tell you when I have next uploaded and also when I am planning on going live. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.